So long story short, this date was a bust. I'd been out with this person called Dalston with this chick and thought that it was going great. And right at the end of the night, she said something so stupidly ignorant that the idea of inviting her home with me was just right out the window. I can't even remember what it was now. It was the 90s. Everyone was ignorant. Probably wasn't even that bad. Either way, it led me to taking the dreaded night bus home. So, picture it. I was a foppish, drunk little so-and-so riding high on my self-righteousness, having just kicked a hot girl to the curb and turned down a night of intercourse to make whatever moral stand I was making. And so naturally, about 5 minutes into my bus ride, I was down regretting absolutely all of my life choices and feeling a little furious with myself. And maybe that's why, when the mouthy punk started calling me all manner of F-bombs and G-bombs and other bombs, I didn't stay quiet. Now, I know that I should have. I should have weathered the storm of insults to my masculinity and sexuality and kept quiet like a good little night bus traveler, like we're supposed to. Instead, I turned around in my seat and told them exactly where they could shove their Doc Martens. And they were the only other two passengers on the bus. One of them was a lanky-looking guy with some spiky red mohawk, and the other was a big chap with green and black hair shaved as sort of a side parting. Now, I couldn't tell if he was all muscle or just fat. Both of them were absolutely foul-mouthed, though, and I told them to stick their boots in each other, and they were floored in silence for a moment. And then, like hooting hyenas, these two idiots began rattling my seat, shaking and punching it without actually hitting me directly. One of them started slapping the bus window, and I just had enough. They'd been sitting on the back row when I'd gotten on, so I'd sat somewhere in the middle, and they'd clearly moved to be behind me. There weren't many rows that I could move forward, but I tried anyway, and about halfway between where I'd started and the driver, I don't know why I thought that this would somehow cause them to leave me alone. Obviously it didn't, and this sign of weakness and fear caused them to just clatter their way down the aisle and jump into the seats behind me. Now cue some more slurs and insults, and one of them ranting about how I'll cut you real good, you little fancy lad. And I was riding the blue balls high and gave them a few more choice words of my own. I caught sight of my driver up front, and she was shaking her head at me, giving me a look sort of like, you know better. And I knew her vaguely. She was this larger black woman who I'd met on the night bus a few times in the past, and was always a good laugh. I somehow hadn't noticed it was her driving when I got on the bus. I guess because I was still sad about my lack of a successful date. I stood up to move again, but once the punks grabbed me and pushed me down in the seat. Oh no, you did not just lay hands on me, I thought, you little rat. And I thought about turning around and just absolutely lamping on one, but I knew that I'd land myself in trouble with the law if I tried. Instead, I tried to get up and move again, and again this punk pushed me back down in the seat. I tried again, he pushed me back down, tried again, and this time, the punk pulled me down so hard that the back of my head knocked against the back of the seat with this very loud crack. The driver shouted at us all to settle down. I said something insulting to them and then quickly left my seat and moved right back behind the driver. I asked her when the next stop was, and she said not for a couple of minutes, but she'd make those punks get off there and not to leave because she thought they'd follow me. And then once again I got back to my seat, and once again they resumed with their slurs and insults. I guess they liked the sound of cracking my head against the back of the seat too, because now one of them did it deliberately, grabbing me around the forehead and pulling my neck back until I was choking. I shook him off and scrambled across the aisle and back a few seats, sort of scrambling my way to safety. These punks got up, absolutely mad at me for daring to shake off their assault, and the bus driver started screaming at them to sit down and leave me alone. But instead they both crowded into the aisle and turned on her. This bigger punk, who I could now see was pure muscle, told the driver he was going to make her wish that she'd never been born. And that's when he pulled an honest-to-God hunting knife out of his belt. I had no idea what happened next until a few moments after. That's when he pulled an honest-to-God hunting knife out of his belt. I had no idea what had happened next until a few moments afterwards. There was this sudden burst of speed, and then an even more sudden stop. The big punk flew forward through the air, his knife clattering into the aisle, and hit the dashboard so hard that I heard the crunching of a bone over the splintering of metal and glass, and the beeping of the bus horn. The punk then crumbles to the floor, flat out unconscious, and the driver was up and out of her seat, yelling at the now open door for someone to call the cops. Then she threw herself onto the other punk, slamming him to the ground and pinning him there, where she then proceeded to legitimately sit on this fella. I took her cue, a little shell-shocked, and kind of ambled over to the unconscious punk and made sure that he was still unconscious, and then shortly afterwards the police did arrive. So what happened, right, was the bus driver had taken an unconventional emergency approach and crashed the bus directly into a wall in an attempt to disrupt the punks from stabbing her or me, and was kind of a genius idea if extremely reckless. The cops took these two yobos away, interviewed me, and then let me go. And I am pleased to report that the bus driver kept her job because I saw her driving the night bus a few more times after that. To this day, she remains my hero, the bus driver who saved me from potentially getting fatally stabbed by risking her life and livelihood to drive into a freaking wall. A very terrifying yet epic night bus journey. We were on a work/business in a South African country that I won't name because I don't want to start a debate. It was mostly a great time with great and diverse people. Now, towards the end of our vacation, though, something very horrific happened that honestly put me off returning to this country ever again. I was there with my fiancée, who is now my wife, and we had a great time, but I won't go into details describing all that because nobody really cares. Now anyways, just picture a generic couple having a generic good time and maybe doing some really cool things. However awesome you want to imagine we were, that's good. Now I'm being flippant, obviously, but it was lovely. The hotel was great, the food was divine, and once my meetings were out of the way, we had time to explore the cities and countryside. Now the country that we were in has this weird mix of quaint and modern architecture, which shouldn't work but really does. Now, tourists are advised to avoid walking alone in certain areas, and we followed that mostly, but towards the end of our vacation, I guess we got complacent, because everything had been so safe and stress-free up until then. Now, after an incredible meal with my wife, we went for a walk and just kind of got lost in each other, walking for hours hand in hand. I kept thinking about how I was the luckiest guy in the world, having this beautiful woman on my arm, especially knowing that she'd agreed to marry me a few months before. And there is nothing gayer than a man who's deeply in love with his wife, fellas, let me tell you that. Now, after a while, we sat on a bench overlooking a lake as the sun set, and we looked up at the stars together, and things were perfect. No, okay, I'll stop going on about my awesome wife now. She told me I was allowed to share this story if I promised to portray her well, so here you go, babe. I love you. She's awesome. Now, it was kind of her fault that we'd wandered so far outside the city, though. She was the one who wanted to look at nature and all that crap. But it was me who called the cab, dialing the number that I'd taken from the hotel lobby. We'd been promised that this was a safe, reliable cab service and had no reason to doubt it. When the driver pulled up, he was all smiles. We checked his ID, his registration. We confirmed that he was actually the driver listed on the cab company's website, all the steps that you're supposed to take. Now we gave him the address of the hotel and he entered it into his GPS. The driver engaged us in this very cheerful conversation, albeit in very broken English, as we began driving. I was sitting in the back with my wife. Looking out the window, it surprised me to realize just how far we'd walked. We were completely in the middle of nowhere, full countryside with no buildings in obvious sight. The cab's headlights and the moon lit the fields as we drove past them. And that's why I didn't really notice when the other vehicle fell into line behind us. After a few minutes, I caught sight of shadows in the driver's rearview mirror and leaned behind to look over my shoulder. I whispered to my wife that a van was following us and it didn't have its headlights on. She called out to the driver and seemed to do a better job of communicating with him than I had. And the driver glanced into his rearview mirror and then gave us this big, beaming smile and told us it was nothing to worry about. I said it was pretty unusual for anyone to be driving at night with no headlights. The driver said it was fine. Some people on these roads didn't want to be noticed, and it was better not to keep looking at them. If they didn't want to be noticed, I said, then why were they tailgating us and getting lit up by our rear lights? And the driver just laughed and kept on driving. Now, a few minutes later, the van behind us flashed its headlights and hit its indicator in a very clear gesture for us to pull over. The driver glanced at me with these very wide eyes and said that we had to stop. My wife, bless her, told him that if he valued his life, then there was no way on God's green earth that he should stop, and in fact, he needed to slam down on the pedal and floor it the heck out of here. The driver wasn't cooperating, though. He pulled over to the side of the road and the van followed. Now we sat there, pinned in the van's headlights as the driver got out and walked behind. We heard a bit of shouting and then footsteps crunching up to the door on my wife's side. My heart sank with dismay as I saw the driver, hands behind his head, being held now at gunpoint by another man in a mask. A second masked man tapped on the window with the barrel of his gun. My wife shrieks, flinching away, but the man gestured for us to get out. So we did. A third masked man slammed me against the side of the car and began patting me down. He proceeds to take my wallet, cell phone, and pretty much everything. And my wife thankfully didn't have to deal with the pat-down treatment, but the guy took her purse and tossed it to the second gunman. Meanwhile, the first guy had secured our cab driver's wrist with what seemed to be this plastic tie and was guiding him to the back of their van. I looked and saw the gunman ushering the driver into the back and then slamming the door. The guy returned, and the three men commanded us to strip. Reluctantly, we did, down to our underwear. The men seemed to find this hilarious and began to insist that we remove our underwear too. Now, not wanting to seem weak in front of them, I dropped my boxers and just stood there, bare-ass and defiant, looking at them. My wife was crying, begging really, and as calmly as I could, I told them to leave her alone. I really thought I was going to have to try wrestling one of the men to get his gun or something if I wanted to protect my wife's dignity, but they just sort of sneered and said whatever, and then one of them said something that I'm sure was derogatory in Afrikaans. The three men snatched up our clothes and shoes. Two of them returned to the van, while the other got into the cab that we'd just been forced out of. Then, without a word, the men drove off, leaving us stranded, naked, and alone in the middle of nowhere. It sounds kind of funny looking back, but it really wasn't at the time. As we walked for almost 2 hours, and the African night was a lot colder than the day. My wife jokes now that this was me making an excuse, but I'm genuinely grateful that we didn't get hypothermia. Thankfully, at some point along the route, we found a large discarded blanket that I turned into a sort of skirt for myself and a shawl for my wife. And eventually, we reached a property whose owners actually kindly helped us call the cops. We were taken to the station, interviewed, and had to make some calls to the U.S. Embassy. It was incredibly stressful and almost scarier than being forced to strip at gunpoint. Almost. The cops really didn't seem to care all that much, not even when we told them that our cab driver had been kidnapped at gunpoint and probably murdered. Two of the officers even said something to each other in Afrikaans and then just laughed. Of course, I wasn't able to remember the name of the cab company either, and when I later tried to find the flyer on the hotel notice board, it was gone. My wife and I wanted to leave the country ASAP, but we had to wait for all the fun crap you deal with when your wallet and phone get robbed in a foreign country. The logistics were a nightmare, and this story would be an hour long simply from explaining them. The final development came the night before we were due to head back to the airport. Everything had been squared away, and we were extremely grateful for the fact that we'd been savvy enough to limit the things that we'd taken with us overnight, with our passports, most of our bank cards, and even my wife's cell phone all being locked up tightly in our hotel room safe. We had been out at a restaurant very close to the hotel for one final meal, and we were just walking home as the sun set. I heard a laugh that sounded distinctly familiar. Now, looking through the crowd, I locked eyes with a very grinning, cheerful man. Our cab driver. I was certain of it. He was sitting at a table with 3 other guys, and they were clearly celebrating something. Our eyes met, and I saw this look of panic crossing that cab driver's face. And by the time I forced myself through the crowd to confront him, he was gone. His 3 other buddies were still at the table, though, and they pleaded ignorance when I tried to speak to them in English, which was odd because most people in this country understand and speak some degree of English. They apparently couldn't understand a word that I was saying to them, though, when I asked them about the guy they'd been with. But they did seem to find me very, very funny. And then one of them pointed to my shirt and said, "Nice." I can't be sure, but I am certain that these were the masked gunmen. In some ways, it was a relief to know that our cab driver hadn't been murdered, and the chances are that we wouldn't have been either. I'm sure the guns were probably fake too, but knowing we'd been scammed by 4 crooks looking to make a quick buck off of the dumb tourists, well, that didn't feel much better if I'm being honest with you. On the other hand, at least nobody got shot. When I was young, I went to college in San Francisco. I often took the bus through the city to visit friends or go to the library. Mostly I hated riding the bus. It stank, the people were weird and rude, and I often got hit on or catcalled. Usually I didn't fear for my life though. But that day was different. I was sitting around the middle of the bus next to a rough-looking guy in worn-out casual clothes. He kept checking his watch and muttering, looking out the window to his left as if it could hurry the bus up. I was barely paying attention to this guy, though. I was looking at a guy a few seats down who was scratching his neck and fidgeting in his seat. He was this white, pale, and sweaty-looking dude, and he looked like he was burning up, but he was wearing a thick coat in the summer, so go figure. He looked like a pretty clear H addict. You'd see them around San Francisco sometimes, and it usually just made me feel sad. Now, this guy was giving off some seriously bad vibes, though, jerking and looking around like he was scoping out the other passengers. I watched as his eyes fixed on an old man across the aisle and 1 or 2 rows ahead of him. The bus traveled on for a few seconds with nothing happening, but I could see the sketchy guy focusing on the old man and staring at him. Eventually, this shifty guy dragged himself from his seat and stumbled across the aisle to where the old man was sitting. He leaned in and grabbed the old guy's shoulder. The old guy looked at him with clear alarm and fear, and the twitchy guy whispered something that I couldn't hear and then reached into his back pocket. I watched as he pulled out his switchblade. Now, I wasn't having any of this. Immediately, I started to get to my feet. The knife guy hadn't seen me, so I could maybe sneak up on him and hit him or grab him. And then something happened that took me completely by surprise. The rough-looking guy sitting next to me grabbed my arm and pulled me back down into my seat. He said something to me, like, "Don't be an idiot, hero." Then I thought he said that he would cut me if I intervened. I just slumped back into my seat in terror, thinking that there were 2 knife men on the bus, maybe in on it together, and I was going to get robbed by this other guy. And then he surprised me by climbing over me and into the aisle. The guy then launches himself down the aisle, screaming, "Freeze! This is the police," or something like that. Now the knife guy whirls around, very jumpy, sweaty, and instinctively raised the knife to protect himself from the charging off-duty cop. And at that exact second, the bus driver slams on the brakes, sending the cop tripping forward. He fell directly onto the blade, and I swear everyone in the bus gasped in unison as they heard the sound of the knife stabbing into him. The off-duty cop stumbled backwards, clutching at, thank God, his arm. Now the knife was sticking out of his bicep, where he'd apparently managed to swivel during his fall. The strung-out dude was staring at his hands, head jerking back and forth between them, genuinely looking like a cartoon. Now, it would have been funny if he hadn't then advanced towards the fallen cop and reached for the knife. Then the biggest twist yet happened. The old guy stood up out of his seat and slammed the knife guy into an arm lock. He clearly didn't have much strength, he was an old dude, but he knew the technique and he was able to restrain him long enough to knock the guy to the ground. A few of the other passengers then piled onto him in the aisle and held him in place. For my part, I ran to the stabbed cop to check if he was okay. He was bleeding a lot, and at first my stupid self went to remove the knife, but he snapped at me not to. Eventually, we arrived at the bus station where on-duty cops were called, and that's when I found out for sure that the stab guy definitely was an off-duty cop. He even apologized for being rough with me and thanked me profusely as he was treated on the back of the ambulance. The old guy was a retired disabled Vietnam vet, and I don't mean to make him out as some kind of action hero in my story. It was very much normal old guy grabs a young junkie, but he definitely knew what he was doing and definitely would have been able to take the guy down solo in his youth. The twitchy, strung-out guy was carted off by the cops and presumably went to jail. I wasn't really the one at risk, but it was still a scary-as-hell situation. It made me very jumpy riding on the bus for years after that. This happened to me last year. I was taking a flight from Atlanta to Tokyo to visit my partner who was working over there. I get kind of nervous about flying, and the prospect of a 15-hour flight was not one I was looking forward to. I did everything I could in advance to ease the panic. I watched stress management YouTube videos, I listened to a relaxing audiobook at the departure gate, and I treated myself with an upgrade to business class. Maybe if I could avoid screaming babies and had a bit more legroom, things could be less stressful. Eventually, just before boarding, I decided that it was all too much and dropped a diazepam. I made my way onto the plane as one of the first aboard, stowed my bag in the overhead compartment, and settled into my window seat and promptly fell asleep. The next thing I knew, I'd groggily sleepwalked my way through the pre-flight checks and the takeoff, and was only vaguely aware that I even had a next-door neighbor in the seat beside mine. I woke up a few hours later, distinctly in the air and feeling a lot more relaxed than I had been when I boarded. Right now, I was alone. With nobody in the seat beside me, I gestured to the flight attendant and asked for a bottle of sparkling mineral water, which was delicious and refreshing and calmed my nerves. I noticed that someone must have been sitting beside me because there was a comic tucked into the front seat. I relaxed back in my seat for a few minutes when a shadow started to loom over me. With a heavy plop, my neighbor landed in his seat, almost causing my sparkling mineral water to spill. I turned to look at them and realized that they were already leaning in, looking at me, very closely in fact. They had a big ginger beard, bleach blonde spiky hair, eyeliner, a septum ring, various other piercings, and one of those flesh tunnels in their ears, and these very wide pupils. "I'm Declan," they slurred. And they thrust their hand into my lap, I guess for me to just shake it, and I managed to do so and then introduce myself. And I don't mean to be rude, but they absolutely reeked. I guess because they just come back from the bathroom, but good God, it was not nice in close quarters. Declan told me that they were non-binary and used he, him, and they, them pronouns. They went on to explain that they worked as some kind of MMA promoter and also a playwright, and then talked at me non-stop for almost an hour. And this sounds like I'm exaggerating, but they would not stop. According to Declan, they were going to change the worlds of both literature and mixed martial arts, and had been told that they had a unique and powerful voice. I wasn't sure about that, but they certainly had a unique and powerful body odor. Eventually it all got too much, and I had to excuse myself to get up and use the bathroom. Declan pretended to shift to let me through, but even with the extra space in business class, I was forced to brush and squeeze up against them to get past. I went to the plane bathroom and spent as long as I could in there without seeming weird. I didn't even need to go, I just needed a break from Declan's weird, intense monologuing. And when I got back, I decided that I'd pretend to nap or put some headphones in and listen to a podcast. Let's read, of course. And when I opened the door to the bathroom, I was met face to face with Declan, and I wish that I was making this next part up. It's genuinely disgusting to me to think about it now, let alone share it, but I think it's an important moment in sharing how effed up the next part is. As I tried to step out of the bathroom, Declan just looked around me, leaning forward, and then took a deliberate and very pointed nasal inhale as if to get a deep whiff of the bathroom after I'd used it. Ugh. Just typing it out again makes me shudder. And then they made direct, unblinking eye contact with me as if to say, "Yeah, you saw what I just did." "Sure did, buddy." And next, Declan put their arm out. You know, in that kind of way that blocks someone from leaving a doorway? They did that, and sort of leaned forward, crotch first, to block me from leaving. And then Declan raised their eyebrows and suggested that I join the Mile High Club with them. Not asked, suggested. And then before I could even answer, they began gently but firmly stepping forward as if to make me back up into the bathroom. Now I'm like, no way, buddy, absolutely not in any universe. Then, my jaw hit the freaking floor when Declan asked if the reason that I wouldn't have intercourse with them in the airplane bathroom was because I had a problem with non-binary people. I was absolutely floored. Surely they had to be joking. But no, Declan was serious. They adopted a severe frown and genuinely started lecturing me on gender norms and innate bigotry. And I couldn't even react. It was like something out of a Twitter user's fever dream, but it was real, and it was happening to me. Declan asked if I thought that maybe I was rejecting their offer because I had innate prejudice. I held my finger up with my engagement ring on it and said no. It's because my future wife wouldn't approve of me joining the Mile High Club with some random stranger regardless of their gender. Declan's fists sort of bunched against the door frame, and they quietly but firmly punched the wall. It wasn't enough to cause any damage or commotion, but it was enough to send a message of, "I am stronger than you and I know it." And I ducked under Declan's arm and made my way back to my seat. On the way, I caught eye contact with one of the flight attendants and tried to give him the universal unspoken facial expression of, "This creep is harassing me." I think he got the message, because a few minutes later, after Declan stopped back into his seat with this thud, the flight attendant came over and asked if everything was okay. I said it was, and requested another sparkling mineral water in around 5 minutes as an excuse to have him come back and check on us. Now Declan was just sort of muttering to himself under their breath. I couldn't make out what they were saying at first, but when I realized, an icy chill went through my chest. Declan was whispering the most vile, unpleasant violence towards me. And I can't even repeat what they were saying because it would affect the video probably, but it was some of the most repugnant things anyone has ever said to me in my life. I couldn't believe it. First, the bizarre accusations of bigotry. And then next, some of the most vile bigotry and slurs you could even imagine. And when the flight attendant came over, Declan stopped yammering on, and then every time we were alone, they kept it up for the entire flight. I was trapped by the window for another 10 hours listening to this maniac just saying vague and nebulous threats under their breath. The worst part is, they did not directly aim them at me. They were just saying things about that woman, and I found myself genuinely just stuck. How do you report someone for threats when they're not directly threatening you? I guess in retrospect that I could have just told the flight attendant that Declan was engaging in this very antisocial behavior, but if anything, this story illustrates how easy it is for someone like Declan to completely make you freeze up. Eventually we landed. I waited for Declan to leave, and at first they didn't. They just stayed stubbornly sitting in their seat, still not shutting up with the yapping. Now, eventually the flight attendant before ushered them up, though, and they took their overhead luggage and left. Only then did I call the attendant over and tell them what had gone on. Now, they quite reasonably, in much nicer terms, told me that I was a freaking idiot for not saying something, and then even encouraged me to tell the Japanese police. I was done with it all, though, and opted not to, and it still bothers me to this day. I spent my entire vacation with my fiancé worried that I'd encountered Declan. Thankfully, I didn't. I know this might not be the most directly terrifying story you've received, but being pinned into my seat having to listen to that kind of verbal cruelty from someone who thought that they were entitled to me and my body, it was so stupidly brazen that the reality of it still genuinely gives me nightmares to this day. I figured you could use this story if you ever do a terrifying first crushes video or cruise ships or anything like that. It's the story of the scariest girl I ever met. So, young love. It's a beautiful, thrilling, daring, and usually a load of bullcrap. I was 16 when I had my first crush that felt like something more. 16 and bored out of my skull on a family cruise. I first caught sight of the girl when we were at the muster drill at the very beginning of the cruise. It was hot as balls out, and a lot of the passengers were clearly uncomfortable, probably traveling from landlocked or cooler states. We were setting sail from Port Miami, my home city, so none of this was very exciting or original to me. Others were a mixture of hyped up and heat-stroked, and as a teenage boy in the year 2000, I was completely over it. I looked around for someone who was sick of all of it as well as I was, and that's when I saw her, Sasha. She was an absolute dream girl for an alternative teenage boy like me, dressed all in black despite the baking summer sun, but barely covered up, if you know what I mean. I don't really want to get into it now, in adulthood and everything, but you gotta know that to the 16-year-old me, Sasha was the most alluring, beautiful, mysterious goth metal chick I'd ever seen in my life. This was from the area when people like us were into Nine Inch Nails, Tool, Pantera, maybe Slipknot and Marilyn Manson if we were forced to admit it. So imagine a dream girl who fits that mold, and that was Sasha. Of course, she was really a nightmare, but hey, is that surprising for a girl who I later caught literally growling at a 5-year-old girl? Now anyways, that's when I next saw Sasha. The cruise had departed for the Mediterranean. We'd had an early dinner, and then my parents had sent me and my older sister off to explore, which meant they either wanted to screw, gamble, or drink, which I figured would be their plan for most of the vacation, both on and off the ship. I wandered around until I found a little arcade, with a few token games, some video games, and even a few machines set to free play. A group of younger kids were crowded around a House of the Dead 2 arcade machine playing like crap. The beautiful girl I'd seen earlier was lurking near an ashtray smoking, which gave my dumb self a little thrill, and they were glaring at the kids. Every now and then she'd make a derogatory comment when one of the kids got hit by a zombie, or whatever those things are in House of the Dead 2 that look like tiny Michael Jacksons. Now my sister, Robin, snuck up behind me and hit me for staring at that girl. She told me to play it cool, and then said that she'd kick the crap out of me if she caught me smoking. Then Robin very kindly disappeared off into the bowels of the ship, leaving me to make my own mistakes. Now, back home, off the ship, I was a shy and awkward kid who kind of skulked around listening to Korn, but I decided that on the ship, I was going to be a confident, cool kid who went around listening to Korn. Pretending like I hadn't been standing there spying on her for the last 15 minutes, I walked up to the girl and introduced myself as Robbie. Yeah, my sister and I are called Robert and Robin, geez. That's when I found out that her name was Sasha, and she was a misanthrope and misandrist. And that's actually what she said. Hi, I'm Sasha. I'm a misandrist and a misanthrope. And she explained that this meant that she hated men and then hated all people, and I pretended like I didn't know this and then pretended like I found it really cool and that I agreed. Yeah, men suck, I said, which seemed to make her laugh genuinely, which I took to be a good sign. And Jesus, I was such a cringelord back then. I wandered through the arcade talking about crap, mostly how everything sucked and the cruise sucked and how modern life sucked and our parents sucked and the kids around us sucked. Sasha told me about all the bands that she liked, which all sucked, and she told me that my taste sucked too, but also that it was cool. Sasha may have been dressed in black, but I can see now that she was one walking, talking red flag, and I would have recognized it at the time if I didn't have such a damn crush on her out of nowhere. I thought I was being really slick and smooth and kept asking to see this pentagram necklace that she was wearing, which, of course, each time it gave me a good look at her cleavage. Now, after a few requests to study it, I kind of realized that Sasha was enjoying the attention, and I relaxed a little, and then trying to be the cool guy who openly checked her out and hit on her. Now, for Sasha's part, the more attention I gave her, the more it seemed to spur her on to want to do crazy things. She led me to the back of the arcades and pointed out that the security cameras didn't reach this area. She knew, she said, because she'd been on this dumb gay cruise 1,000 times. There was a digital cornhole machine that could be used to get a bunch of tickets, and Sasha showed me how to use the chain attached to my wallet to crack the plastic around the ticket dispenser and cause a roll of tickets to come out. I hesitated until Sasha got angry at me, saying that I was just like the others. Now, nervously, I looked around, and then suddenly as I could, I broke the machine. A limp strip of about 10 tickets came flopping out, and Sasha took them, got a little sneery, and then immediately threw them into the trash. Now next, Sasha took me on a walk through the main atrium. She told me to stand on one side of the big central staircase and watch her as she walked through the crowd. I had no idea why, but I didn't mind having an excuse to stare at her, so I did. I got to admit, she was a master. She walked through the crowd, gently knocking into people here and there, and then being all sweetness and smiles when she apologized. At one point, I saw her gesturing to her leg and implying that she had some sort of disability, and an old woman even kissed her on the forehead, which made me laugh as Sasha's face turned to hidden horror. Eventually, Sasha reached me and dragged me out of the atrium. She found a secluded spot under the stairs in a staff-only area of the ship, which gave me a little thrill again. And there, she pulled a bunch of wallets and purses out of her jacket. She must have stolen at least 4 or 5, as well as a wristwatch and a bracelet. I was kind of amazed, but then horrified. I tried arguing with her that we'd get in serious trouble if she kept this stuff, and that's when she first started showing her true crazy. She leaned into me and whispered that if I told anyone, she would not only blame me, but also claim that I'd done terrible and unspeakable things to her to shut her up. Now, looking into her eyes, I genuinely believed her. And then she smiled at me and said something along the lines of, well, this wouldn't happen because of course I'd keep my mouth shut. And then she removed all the paper money from the purses and wallets and then threw everyone's cards and belongings down a garbage chute. I was horrified, but didn't feel like I could really say anything at that point. Somehow over the next few days, I kept finding myself hanging out with this Sasha, even though the novelty was starting to wear off. This was the point in my life where I discovered that I didn't care how hot someone was if they were an awful person. The problem now was that Sasha was kind of bullying me into spending time with her because I'd been present for some of her crimes, and I was too socially awkward and lacking in confidence to consider just saying, hey, I didn't do this, the girl did. For example, a couple of days after the pickpocketing, Sasha made me accompany her to one of the play areas for young children. There, she found a girl playing by herself and kept telling her about how someone had fallen overboard and died, and that she'd heard it was the girl's mother. The girl, for her part, didn't believe Sasha at first, but Sasha wouldn't relent. She described some genuinely very violent and unpleasant scenarios about the girl's mother being eaten by sharks, or dragged under by an octopus, or decimated by the ship's propellers. In the end, it got too much for the girl, who ran off crying, much to Sasha's amusement. And she bullied a few other little kids too, which just felt sick and tasteless to me. Now, another time, she tried to force me to break into a vending machine, again in the crew quarters. She laughed and said that some loser on the crew would take the blame, so why should we care? At this point, it became obvious that Sasha was just trying to be deliberately cruel and unpleasant. I couldn't decide if she was trying to impress me or make me hate her, and looking back with adult insight, I think it was a little bit of both. Kind of sad, really, but at the same time, all I wanted was to be rid of her. I refused to vandalize the vending machine and stormed off to the sound of her trying to pry the keypad off of the front. Somehow, Sasha found me later in the water park of all places. I was sure that she wouldn't be seen dead there, but she showed up in a black bikini with a slur written on the crotch. And I could tell that she was trying to win me back over, and I had to fight all my teenage hormones not to let her succeed. When she reached into her bikini top and somehow removed a box of pushpins, my heart sank. You see, the plan, she said, was to toss these down the water slide and see what happened. I said that there was no way I was going along with this, and there were little kids playing here, and also my sister was swimming with some friends. This was the first time that I mentioned my sister, and Sasha's eyes turned murderous. She demanded that I point my sister out to her, and then started asking me super weird questions, like if I thought my sister was cooler than her, or smarter than her, and then eventually prettier than her. And I'm like, gross, dude, I don't think about my sister in that way. But Sasha didn't seem to care. She was clearly furiously jealous of my sister for even existing, and this made her more determined to toss those pins down the water slide. I could only see one solution. I grabbed the box of those things from Sasha and then just tossed them over the side of the ship. The water park was on the one deck, so it wasn't difficult to send that box of pins falling hundreds of feet into the ocean below. Nobody even noticed. Now, I expected Sasha to be furious at me, but instead, she just sort of smiled and said that I passed the test and that I was a good person, so maybe I'd finally get my reward. Now, it was pretty clear what she was suggesting from her body language, and I hate the fact that I fell for it like some stupid teenage boy. Sasha told me to meet her back on the same deck after dark. There was a smoking area that some of the passengers came to at night, but it was mostly quiet and we wouldn't be disturbed. And then she leaped into the pool and disappeared into the crowd of people. I ate dinner with my parents and Robin in the fanciest restaurant that night, but I could barely eat anything, feeling a mixture of excitement and mostly nervous sickness about meeting Sasha. I knew she was bad news, and even though she was the hottest girl who'd ever paid attention to me, I knew deep down that it just wasn't worth it. I thought about bringing it up to my parents or Robin, but they'd all seemed to be having such a good time. My sister went off with some friends that she met on the ship, my parents went to an 18-plus cabaret show, and I just resigned myself to go and meet Sasha. Maybe I'd get something out of it, at least. I was walking along a small, shadowy deck leading to the main water park promenade deck when I felt someone grab me. I was slammed up against the railing, which came up to my chest. Sasha at this point was hissing at me, her face this just ball of fury. She was mad, so mad that I'd thrown her pins into the water. And then she started accusing me of being a perv, a creep, all sorts of things. She said that she'd kept some of the credit cards and belongings that she'd stolen from the crew, and that she was going to plant them in my sister's cabin. I told her that she had no idea what cabin my sister was in, and Sasha proved me wrong by telling me exactly where Robin was staying, and a whole bunch of other stuff about her. Sasha said that she'd ruin my sister's life if I didn't do what she said. I asked her what she wanted, and she told me that I had to climb over the railing and throw myself into the sea. She said I'd be fine and it would be funny, but I had to do it to prove myself to her and protect Robin. Now, I might have been a dumb kid, but even I wasn't dumb enough to think that you could just jump off the side of a 2,000-passenger cruise ship and survive it. There are 100 ways that could kill you. Sure, it could be possible to survive the initial fall, but even then I'd have to trust Sasha to immediately raise the alarm, trust myself not to get sucked under the ship, which would almost certainly happen, and trust the sharks that no doubt circled in the Mediterranean waters not to eat me. It had been a full sea day that day, so we were nowhere even close to land. What Sasha was asking me to do was obviously very, very stupid. I looked at her and just said, no, of course I won't do that. I figured that people don't really just successfully frame other people for random crimes, especially not weird, angry 16-year-old goth girls. I could just tell someone what Sasha was threatening and it would be fine. I guess Sasha knew that her threats were impotent too, because instead she lunges at me, taking me completely by surprise. She was a petite girl, but in that moment, she possessed a wild strength as she tried to push me up and over the damn railing. I don't think there was any chance that she could have managed it, but then she grabbed me in between my legs and began to squeeze hard, telling me to get the hell over the edge and into the effing sea if I knew what was good for me. I flailed my arms out and grabbed hold of the only thing I could, one of those plastic lifebelts that are positioned all along the decks of the ships. I grabbed one of the plastic handles, swung it forward, and smacked Sasha straight in the head with it. And I swear, I hit her so damn hard in my fury that the lifebelt actually shattered. I'd been lying if I said that I regretted it. I'd never hit a girl before or since, but I can live with myself doing it this once. Immediately I was calling for help, and some other passengers and the ship's crew eventually came running over. Thankfully, the deck had grainy security camera coverage, and there had been a few distant eyewitnesses too, so the reason for my assault on Sasha was eventually easily corroborated. I told the ship's security crew the whole story, admitting to every part that I played in it, staying silent while Sasha went on her pickpocketing and vandalizing spree. Now, a few times I saw a couple of the security guys sharing these very knowing looks, like my story was explaining some stuff. Things got a bit weird after that. My parents started monitoring Robin and I a little closer, so we didn't have much freedom for the rest of the cruise. Instead, we spent quality family time together on the boat and in various parts. I had no idea what happened to someone if they committed a crime on a cruise ship. My parents and Robin tell the story like I was worried sick about Sasha and the aftermath, and I guess I kinda was. She was a minor and I knew nothing about her. She said that she'd come to the cruise with her people, which I took to mean her family, but I had no real idea. And while we were still on the boat, despite my parents insisting I forget about her and try to enjoy the rest of the vacation, I begged them to see if they could find out what happened to Sasha. It was very odd, and to this day I still have no real answers about what became of her. When Dad spoke to the head of security, and I'm sure a little money changed hands to get this information, he admitted that they hadn't been able to identify who Sasha was actually on board with. She wouldn't provide them with her real name, and there was nobody unaccounted for on the guest list who matched her description. They said that this had to mean that she was the kid of one of the crew members, but if so, then she was on board illegally. And because of this, they had no choice but to keep her locked in the brig for the rest of the voyage. And since she was a minor, she couldn't be handed over to authorities in the Mediterranean either, and had to be processed back in Port Miami. Obviously, I never saw her again. Near the end of the voyage, Dad checked in with the head of security again, and all he could tell us was that there had been no further developments with identifying Sasha. So, to this day, the most memorable cruise I ever took was a terrifying one where the girl of my dreams tried to force me overboard and get involved in crimes. I never even got to find out her real name, and it's entirely possible that the girl I spent the first week of my vacation with was a genuine, real-life stowaway. Hi, let's read. Have you ever been to Covent Garden? It's a lovely touristy area of London with loads of shops and fun things to do. Whenever I'm in London for work, which isn't often, I try to spend a bit of spare time there to go shopping. However, every time I'm there, especially if I take the tube from Covent Garden, I'm reminded of something that happened to me over 20 years ago that may have been one of the scariest moments in my life. It was pretty late at night, and I had been out in London with some friends. It was during my college days, and one of my old housemates had transferred unis to one of the London ones and invited us down for a flat-warming party. The flat-warming was the next day, Friday, but that Thursday I'd popped into central London to meet up with some other friends and hang out. I didn't get drunk, but was a tiny bit tipsy, and I found myself needing to get the tube back home to Southgate where my friend stayed. Originally, the plan was for the guy that I had been out with to come home with me, but things didn't really work out there. Instead, we went our separate ways, which is how I found myself trying to get home alone. Taking the tube, even late at night, is normally pretty safe and simple, especially on the Piccadilly line, so I wasn't bothered. By the time I left the bar, the weather was absolutely foul, full-on thundering rainstorm, and it was late October and it had been a pretty mild month, but now the heavens just split open. Just completely foul weather to match the mood that I was in after things didn't work out with the guy. Of course, I didn't have a bloody brolly either, so I dashed for the Covent Garden tube station, and I didn't normally like getting on the tube at the station back then for reasons you'll soon see, but this time I was like, screw it. Now, I've never seen Covent Garden station so empty. There was barely anyone about. The folks that were seemed as miserable and tired as I was. I remember there was a filthy-looking old man sitting near the bins, shivering in the rain. I ignored him and headed to the stairs. I have a crushing fear of elevators. It's not claustrophobia, but it's just elevators. That's why I normally avoid Covent Garden Station, especially as an exit, because there's a 193-step staircase leading down to or up from the platforms. And even though I was tired, heading down wouldn't be so bad though, I thought. If you've ever been to Covent Garden Station, the staircase is creepy, to say the least. It's a winding spiral staircase, fairly narrow for a public one. In the inner wall is a metal grate, like something out of a horror movie where the real world transforms into a sort of rusted-looking hell. It unsettled me at the best of times, but on this particular night, after I'd gone about 20 steps down, I heard lone, creeping footsteps behind me. For some reason, I decided to stop and listen, and the footsteps stopped too. I walked on a bit more, and the footsteps returned, and I was sure that it wasn't just some echo of my own steps. I wished hard for another late-night pedestrian to come jogging down the stairs, or for me to meet a crowd going up. And not much chance of that on these stairs. People normally avoided them, but especially tonight when everyone with any sense had already gotten indoors. I walked down a bit more and the person followed me. Their footsteps were light, and I became convinced that this was because they were trying to hide their presence. I stopped, and they stopped. I walked, and they walked. I wanted to start running, but I didn't trust myself, since I was still a little bit tipsy from the bar and I was wearing heels. I thought about slipping them off, but the idea of running down the Covent Garden stairs in bare feet, stepping on God knows what, sent a shudder through me. The person following me let out a strange, eerie whistling sound. I don't know what they were trying to achieve with that other than to terrify me, but terrify me it did. I started hurrying down the stairs and their footsteps sped up too. I paused, and again so did they. This time I reached into my purse and gripped my keys in my fist. Not the best weapon, but it'd do. For a second I even considered turning around and marching back up to meet them, but I very quickly realized that'd be extremely stupid. Instead, I carried on jog-walking down the stairs. The person was following me at an even pace, and every now and then when I stopped, I'd catch a glimpse of their shadow just lurking around the corner. I knew if I could get down on the station and onto the tube, everything would be fine. With the whistling and the stop-start footsteps, it felt like my stalker was just trying to psych me out. They were toying with me, trying to scare me, but probably didn't intend to do anything physical or serious, right? I had to hope anyway. I figured that if they were going to attack me, then halfway down the secluded stairs of Covent Garden Station would have been the perfect place to do so, but instead they were keeping pace with me. I kept walking. My stalker let out another strange whistle, but now I was getting paranoid that they were actually summoning some other attacker, like calling on a gang or something. I remember that old movie that I'd seen at uni, The Warriors, and the line, "Warriors, come out to play," started echoing in my head. I started whispering it to myself like a mantra or sort of a war cry. I wouldn't be the victim. I was the warrior, and I'd fight anyone who cornered me in this dirty staircase that stank of piss and damp, and there was no way that I was dying here today on the damn underground, and thank God. My feet hit the last step and I could speed up a little, darting through the corridors to the platform. And that's when I heard the footsteps behind me speed up too. No way was I stopping to confront my pursuer now. There was 3 minutes until the next train if it was on time. Surely there'd be someone else on the platform too. It was never completely deserted. Other passengers would have come down here via the elevator. I burst onto the platform to see nobody. God damn it. I let out an actual moan of frustration, and the footsteps were echoing down the corridor behind me. "You okay?" The guy's voice made me jump. He'd been standing on the other side of a vending machine completely out of sight, and I guess when he'd heard me, he'd stepped out. He was a middle-aged guy in a very smart business suit. Totally normal, nondescript-looking guy. He held a briefcase, I remember that, and I found him instantly reassuring. He reminded me of my mom's brother, my uncle. Not wanting to seem weird or creepy, I walked over to him as quickly as I could and explained that I thought that there was someone stalking me down the staircase. The businessman seemed skeptical, obviously. Couldn't have just been another passenger taking the same route? I explained the stop-start footsteps and the odd whistling, and he agreed that that was definitely eerie, but that I was fine now. I could just stick with him. And then he joked that whoever had been following me must have just given up because nobody was coming down the corridor now. Almost exactly as he said it, a figure emerged from around the corner. And you know when you can just tell that someone's behaving suspiciously? This girl was like that. She pretty much crept around the corner, looking for all the world exactly like a stalker who'd just been following someone down the stairs. She was peering about with these wide, frantic eyes of an addict. Her skin was dirty with sweat and acne, her hair plastered to her head with what could have been rain or grease. And she also looked to be no older than me, maybe even younger. If she wasn't homeless, then she was dressed like she could have been. Her clothes were filthy. One detail that always stuck with me all these years later, even when I'm not sure if I've embellished other things in my memory, was the fact that she wore mismatched shoes. One was a dirty trainer that had previously been white at some time. The other was a torn black Converse with neon pink patterns on it, and her footwear stuck with me this whole time. I don't know why. The businessman whispered that it seems like my stalker had finally shown up, and she must have heard him because it caught her attention, and that's when she noticed me and him. I've never seen someone go from acting so suspicious and threatening to being so terrified before. It was like the predator suddenly and immediately became prey. The girl looked at me and then looked at the businessman and genuinely froze on the spot. Then, honest to God, she let out an actual small scream as she looked him in the face. And then my stalker spun on her heel. I finally understood that phrase after this, and fully ran back around the corner and down the corridor. I heard the footsteps of her mismatched shoes slapping against the station floor and the panicked whistling that she let out as she ran. Next thing I knew, the train had pulled up. The businessman invited me to ride with him as far as his stop. I told him I was getting off at Southgate, and he was all, "Hey, me too, and we can ride the whole way together then." And so, grateful to the man for managing to scare away my dangerous stalker, I rode the short journey with him while telling him all about my uni course, my ambitions for the future, and talking about the 2002 World Cup that had just concluded the previous summer, of all things. And then he got off at Southgate with me and even escorted me near to my friend's flat, which I thought was very kind of him. Relieved to be safe from my weird stalker, I went into my friend's flat, made a cup of tea, and thought nothing more of it. That is, until I told my friend the whole story shortly after. I was so wrapped up in explaining how my savior had scared the stalker off with a single glance that I hadn't considered the real question. Why the hell had my stalker, the young girl, been so utterly terrified to see the businessman? He'd just been standing there with me. He didn't threaten her or even acknowledge her. Sure, if she'd been planning to rob me, maybe it could have been frustrating to realize that I was now with someone, but this didn't feel like that. She'd come around that corner all furtive and sneaky, and then she'd seen the businessman and literally let out a scream and ran away. Maybe I've let my imagination add in the next bit, but when I think back on it, I'm now convinced that I saw a look of recognition on her face when she saw him. The girl was definitely following me with some kind of ill intent. She stalked me all the way down those stairs and then came creeping onto the platform looking for me. So she was a scary person herself. But what was it about the businessman that would send even someone like that running in fear? I rode home with the guy. He walked me almost to my friend's door, and I didn't get any bad vibes from him, but that doesn't mean anything at all. My stalker clearly did. I'm convinced that she recognized him and maybe even knew him, and he'd previously done something to her that was even more terrifying than whatever she planned to do to me. I have no idea what this is, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but I can't shake the feeling that my savior that night could have been way more dangerous than the person he saved me from. And unless one day I see his much older face on the news, I guess I'll never know. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember,
Goth Latinas are where it's at.